The fluorescent lights hummed above the compound on the night of August 4th, 1944. In Barrack 14 of B Compound, Cowra Prisoner of War Camp, New South Wales, Australia, Private First Class Hajime Toyoshima couldn't sleep. Neither could the other 1,103 Japanese prisoners of war surrounding him. They'd been awake for hours, some sharpening makeshift knives from scavenged metal, others fashioning clubs from bed slats. A few sat in silent meditation. Outside, 6 guard towers overlooked the camp's perimeter, their searchlights sweeping across the wire fences in regular intervals. The Australian soldiers of the 22nd Garrison Battalion had no idea that in less than 6 hours they would face the largest prison escape attempt in World War II history. But this wouldn't be an escape in any conventional sense. Most of the men preparing to charge the fences had no intention of reaching freedom. They intended to die. This is the story of how 1,000 Japanese soldiers rejected the shelter of mercy itself and paid for that rejection with their lives. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what happened at Cowra, we must first understand what it meant to be a Japanese soldier in 1944 who had committed the unthinkable act of surrender. The Japanese military code, officially enshrined in the Senjin-kun or Field Service Code, issued in January 1941, contained a single devastating principle: do not give up under any circumstances, keeping in mind your responsibility not to tarnish the glorious history of the Imperial Army with its tradition of invincibility. The code was explicit. A soldier captured alive had broken an absolute taboo. He had chosen survival over honor, existence over extinction, the individual over the nation. In the Japanese military culture of the time, this made him worse than dead. It made him nothing. The propaganda machine reinforced this daily. Soldiers were told that their families would be notified they had died gloriously in battle. To return home as a prisoner would expose the lie, bringing unbearable shame not just to themselves but to their entire family line. Parents would be ostracized. Wives would be expected to treat their returned husbands as ghosts. Children would carry the stain of a father who had chosen dishonor. The Japanese government explicitly stated that any prisoner of war returning to Japan would face execution. Whether this was literally true mattered less than the fact that soldiers believed it absolutely. But there was another layer to this indoctrination, one that would prove crucial at Cowra. Japanese soldiers were also taught that Allied forces were barbaric, that they tortured prisoners, that capture meant unimaginable suffering followed by death. Better to die fighting than to endure whatever horrors the enemy would inflict. This belief was so deeply embedded that when Japanese forces captured Allied soldiers, they treated them with contempt and brutality because that's what they assumed would happen to them if roles were reversed. The death rate among Allied prisoners in Japanese camps was 27%, compared to just 4% of Allied prisoners held by Germany and Italy. The Japanese couldn't conceive of treating prisoners humanely because their entire worldview said that anyone who surrendered had forfeited their right to human treatment. So when approximately 35,000 Japanese soldiers found themselves captured by Western Allied forces during the Pacific War, a tiny fraction compared to the millions who chose death, they entered captivity in a state of profound psychological crisis. They had violated the deepest principle of their identity. Many refused to give their real names, hoping their families would never learn they had survived. Some attempted suicide repeatedly. Others cooperated extensively with Allied interrogators, reasoning that since they had already broken all ties with Japan, they might as well provide intelligence. They were men without a country, without honor, without a future they could imagine. And then they encountered something completely unexpected. They were treated well. The Cowra camp had opened in October 1941, originally designed to house Italian and German prisoners captured in the Mediterranean theatre. The facility sprawled across 75 acres of gently rolling farmland about 300 kilometres west of Sydney. The camp was divided into 4 compounds, A, B, C and D, separated by internal roads called Broadway and No Man's Land. Each compound could hold roughly 1,000 prisoners. The perimeter was secured by double barbed wire fences, 6 guard towers and regular patrols. By most standards of the time, especially by the standards of camps in active war zones, Cowra was well maintained. The first Japanese prisoners arrived in 1942. By August 1944, the camp held 2,223 Japanese prisoners of war, including 544 merchant seamen whose ships had been sunk. They were housed primarily in B compound, with Japanese officers kept separate in D compound. The remaining compounds held Italian prisoners, along with some Koreans and Taiwanese who had served in the Japanese military and Indonesian civilians detained at the request of the Dutch East Indies government. The Australian government operated its POW system according to the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. This meant specific, codified standards. Prisoners received adequate food, not luxurious, but sufficient calories to maintain health. They had access to medical care. They could receive Red Cross packages. They were allowed to organize their own internal administration, elect representatives, practice their religion, and maintain cultural activities. They were not subjected to forced labor beyond camp maintenance. They were not tortured, starved, or executed for minor infractions. By the standards of World War II POW camps, especially in the Pacific Theatre, these were remarkably humane conditions. This created an immediate psychological problem for the Japanese prisoners. Everything they'd been taught said that capture meant torture and death. Instead, they found themselves in a camp where Australian guards, mostly older veterans and young men deemed unfit for frontline service, treated them with basic professional courtesy. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Some prisoners adapted by deciding that the Australians were weak, that their mercy was contemptible. Others fell into deeper despair if they were being treated well. It meant they would survive, which meant their shame would be permanent. Cultural misunderstandings deepened the divide. The Australian guards had little understanding of Japanese military culture. They saw prisoners who refused to make eye contact, who seemed hostile despite good treatment, who rejected friendly gestures. The Japanese prisoners saw guards who smiled, which they interpreted as mockery. They saw casual attitudes toward military discipline, which they read as weakness. When guards tried to be kind, prisoners saw confirmation that their captors were soft, contemptible men who had never understood what it meant to fight with honor. The Japanese prisoners in B compound developed their own internal hierarchy and routine. They elected a compound secretary, held formations, and maintained discipline among themselves. To the Australian authorities, this looked like productive self-governance. What they didn't fully understand was that this internal organisation was also planning something else. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, there were discussions, quiet, careful discussions about what a proper Japanese soldier should do in this situation. The answer, to many, was obvious: escape and die fighting. In June 1944, a Korean prisoner working as an informant, recorded in some sources by the name Matsumoto, told Australian authorities that the Japanese prisoners in B compound were planning a mass breakout The Australians took the warning seriously. They installed 2 Vickers machine guns in positions overlooking the compound. They increased patrols. They prepared contingency plans. But they still didn't fully grasp what they were dealing with. To the Australian military mind, an escape attempt made sense only if prisoners believed they had a reasonable chance of success, of actually escaping, blending into the population, reaching a port, somehow getting back to Japan. None of that was remotely possible from Cowra. The town was 300 kilometers inland. The prisoners were Asian men in a predominantly white country. They had no resources, no contacts, no way to survive in the Australian bush, even if they got past the fences. An escape attempt was, by any rational military calculation, suicide. That was precisely the point. On August 4th, 1944, camp authorities informed the prisoners in B compound that 700 men, everyone below the rank of Lance Corporal, would be transferred to another camp at Hay, about 400 kilometers west. This was standard procedure under Article 26 of the Geneva Convention, which required advance notification of prisoner transfers. The Australians were following the rules, trying to do things properly, treating their prisoners with the procedural dignity that international law required. To the Japanese prisoners, this announcement was unacceptable for reasons the Australians couldn't fathom. The men of B compound had formed bonds. They had created a community, a small piece of Japan maintained through shared ritual and discipline. To separate them was to destroy the last thing they had. More importantly, it meant some would be moved to different camps where they wouldn't know the other prisoners, where they'd be even more isolated, even more alone with their shame. The compound leadership made a decision. If they were going to be separated anyway, better to die together as Japanese soldiers than to live apart as dishonored prisoners. The planning intensified immediately. Throughout the afternoon and evening of August 4th, quiet orders passed from barracks to barracks. Men fashioned weapons from whatever materials they could find, knives ground from pieces of metal, scavenged from work details, clubs carved from bed frames, baseball bats weighted with stones. Some prisoners prepared lengths of blankets to throw over the barbed wire. Others volunteered for specific assault teams. 3 groups would form, one to attack the guard towers and machine gun positions, one to break through the perimeter fence and scatter into the countryside, and one to fight their way to D compound, where the Japanese officers were held, hoping to free them and die together in a final charge. The plan had no realistic chance of success as an escape. Every man involved understood this. The goal wasn't freedom, it was death with honor, death that would erase the shame of capture, death that might allow their families back in Japan to believe they had died fighting rather than surrendering. Some prisoners wrote final letters they had no way to send. Others gathered what few personal possessions they had and destroyed them, preparing to leave nothing behind. A few attempted to convince the camp's senior Japanese officer, Lieutenant Takeo Kawaguchi in D compound, to support the attempt, but he refused, believing it was suicide and violated their obligation to survive as witnesses to Japan's eventual victory. His refusal didn't matter. The men of B compound were committed. Shortly after midnight, as August 5th began, Private Toyoshima and over 1,000 other prisoners began their final preparations. The compound fell into an eerie quiet. Guards on duty noticed nothing unusual. The prisoners often went to bed early, maintained strict discipline, and kept to themselves. At approximately 1:45 a.m., the night was still and cool, the temperature hovering around 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The guard tower's searchlights continued their regular sweeps. The sentries walked their posts. Everything appeared normal. At approximately 1:50 a.m., a single prisoner ran toward the camp gates, screaming. The sentries couldn't understand his words. He was shouting in Japanese, his voice high and frantic. Was he trying to alert them? Was this some kind of disturbance? Before they could process what was happening, an unauthorized bugle call pierced the night. Then the compound exploded into motion. The barracks doors burst open simultaneously. Over 1,000 Japanese prisoners poured out, moving in coordinated waves toward 3 separate objectives. They weren't running in panic, they were attacking in formation, just as they'd been trained, just as their military doctrine demanded. The men in the lead carried makeshift shields fashioned from bedboards. Behind them came the ones with clubs and knives. The third wave carried blankets to throw over the wire. They were shouting, "Banzai! 10,000 years," the traditional Japanese battle cry. But some witnesses reported hearing something else mixed in. Some prisoners were shouting, "Totsugeki," charge, while others yelled what sounded like farewells, final statements, prayers. Private Ralph Jones, a 22-year-old guard in Tower 6, saw the mass of prisoners surging toward his position and froze for a crucial second, unable to believe what he was seeing. Then his training took over, and he opened fire with his rifle. The sound of gunfire shattered the night. Within seconds, the 2 Vickers machine guns that had been installed after the June warning opened up, their heavy-caliber rounds tearing into the charging prisoners at a rate of 450 rounds per minute. The prisoners in the first wave were cut down immediately. Bodies crumpled and fell, blocking the paths of those behind them. But the second wave didn't stop. They trampled over their dead comrades and kept charging. When they fell, the third wave followed. The Australian guards were firing as fast as they could, but the sheer mass of humanity surging at them was overwhelming. Some guards later reported that they could barely see individual prisoners in the darkness, just a surging mass of bodies, the sound of running feet, the screaming, the bugle calls that kept blowing even as men died. The prisoners attacking the guard towers used their numbers to devastating effect. At Tower 4, Private Benjamin Hardy emptied his rifle into the approaching wave, then drew his pistol. When that was empty, he grabbed his bayonet. The prisoners swarmed his position. Hardy fought hand to hand for several minutes before being overwhelmed. He was stabbed repeatedly with makeshift knives. He would later die from his wounds, one of 4 Australian soldiers killed that night. Meanwhile, the second assault wave was targeting the perimeter fence. Dozens of prisoners threw blankets and clothing over the barbed wire, then began climbing over, helping push each other through even as the wire tore their flesh. The machine gun fire was concentrated on the main assault routes, which meant the outer perimeter had gaps. Approximately 300 prisoners made it over the fence and into the open countryside. But this wasn't an organized escape, it was chaos. Some prisoners ran blindly into the darkness. Others stopped just outside the wire, unsure what to do now that they were technically free. Some turned around and tried to fight their way back into the camp, apparently seeking death in combat rather than freedom in the Australian bush. The third assault group, attempting to fight its way to D compound to free the Japanese officers, encountered the heaviest resistance. The Australian garrison, now fully alerted, concentrated fire on Broadway, the internal road the prisoners needed to cross. The prisoners charged directly into machine gun fire. They kept charging even as their comrades fell. They kept charging when it became mathematically impossible to succeed. Witnesses reported seeing prisoners step over mounting piles of bodies to continue the attack. This wasn't tactical assault, it was mass suicide with extra steps. Lieutenant Yoshiwara Sho, one of the senior Japanese enlisted leaders who had helped plan the breakout, was shot multiple times in the initial charge. He continued fighting until he collapsed from blood loss. Before he died, he was seen trying to crawl forward, still attempting to reach D compound. Private Nakano Yoshio made it over the outer fence, ran approximately 100 meters into open farmland, then stopped, turned around, and charged back toward the camp. He was shot by a sentry before he reached the wire. His body was later found facing the compound. Inside B compound, prisoners who hadn't joined the initial charge began setting fires. They torched their own barracks, destroying the structures they'd lived in for months or years. The flames illuminated the scene, casting everything in orange and shadow. In that flickering light, the Australian guards could finally see the full scope of what was happening. Bodies were strewn everywhere. Wounded prisoners crawled across the ground. Some were trying to reach the wire. Others were trying to reach makeshift weapons. Still others were simply trying to reach a place where they could die properly. And then the guards witnessed something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Japanese prisoners were killing each other. Some prisoners had decided that the breakout was dishonorable, that it violated their duty to survive as POWs and bear witness. Others had refused to participate because they believed escape was impossible. Now, in the chaos and darkness, prisoners who had chosen to fight were turning on prisoners who had chosen not to. Makeshift knives flashed. Men grappled in the shadows. The Australians couldn't always tell who was fighting whom. Lance Corporal Matsumoto Tadaaki was beaten to death by other prisoners, apparently for being suspected of being the informant who had warned the guards in June. Private Suzuki Hiroshi was stabbed repeatedly by fellow prisoners after he tried to surrender to an Australian guard. The violence was fracturing along factional lines, those who embraced death versus those who chose survival, those who believed in the breakout versus those who thought it was futile. By 3 a.m., roughly 90 minutes after the breakout began, the Australian garrison had regained control of the compound. The Vickers guns fell silent. The fires were being contained. The last pockets of resistance were surrendering or dying. The scene inside B compound was apocalyptic. Dead bodies lay everywhere on the parade ground, piled against the fences, sprawled in the doorways of burning barracks. The wounded were crying out in Japanese, calling for help, for water, for death. Blood soaked into the dirt. The smell of gunpowder mixed with smoke from the burning buildings. Private Jones, who had survived the assault on his tower, climbed down and walked through the compound in a daze. He later reported that he couldn't process what he was seeing. These were men who had been well fed, well housed, and treated according to international law, and they had chosen this. They had chosen to die in what they must have known was a hopeless attack. He saw prisoners who had slit their own throats rather than be recaptured. He saw men who had hanged themselves from the rafters of barracks, even as the building burned around them. He saw prisoners who had committed seppuku ritual suicide by disembowelment, using makeshift blades, lying in pools of their own blood with their intestines spilled across the ground. By dawn on August 5th, the immediate crisis was over. The final death toll inside the compound was staggering. 134 Japanese prisoners dead, another 78 wounded. On the Australian side, 4 soldiers were killed and 4 wounded. But the night wasn't over yet. Approximately 300 prisoners were still at large in the countryside. The manhunt began at first light. The Australian military mobilised every available unit. Police, civilian volunteers, and Aboriginal trackers joined the search. They found prisoners hiding in culverts, in farm buildings, in patches of bush. Most were easily recaptured. They were exhausted, wounded, disoriented, and had nowhere to go. But the searchers also found something else. More bodies. 65 prisoners who had escaped the compound had committed suicide in the hours after the breakout. Some had hanged themselves from trees. Others had drowned themselves in farm dams and creeks. Several had used makeshift weapons to kill each other in agreed-upon mutual suicide pacts. 2 prisoners were found dead near the town of Ugaura. Over 50 kilometers from the camp, they'd made it farther than any others, only to kill themselves when they realized they had no realistic way to continue. The tracker teams reported finding prisoners who seemed to be deliberately making themselves visible, as if inviting recapture or death. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By August 14th, 9 days after the breakout, the last escapee was recaptured. The final toll was devastating. 231 Japanese prisoners dead, 108 wounded. 4 Australian soldiers killed, 4 wounded. Of the 231 Japanese dead, investigators determined that 31 had been killed by initial Australian gunfire, 12 more died from wounds received in the fighting, and the remaining 188 had died by suicide either during the breakout or in the days after. The ratio was stark. For every Japanese prisoner killed by Australian bullets, 6 had killed themselves. The Australian government immediately launched an official inquiry. Prime Minister John Curtin personally presented the findings to the House of Representatives on September 8, 1944. The conclusions were matter of fact but puzzling. Camp conditions were in accordance with the Geneva Convention. No complaints about treatment had been filed before the incident. The breakout appeared to be premeditated and coordinated. The Australian garrison's response had been appropriate and had likely prevented even greater loss of life. The inquiry found no evidence of mistreatment, no failure of camp administration, nothing that would explain by Australian military logic why over 1,000 prisoners would attempt an escape that was obviously suicidal. But buried in witness statements and interrogations of surviving prisoners, a more complex picture emerged. The prisoners hadn't been trying to escape Australia. They'd been trying to escape shame. Corporal Kanazawa Toshio, who survived despite being shot twice, told interrogators, "We knew we couldn't reach Japan. We knew we would be caught or killed. But we could not continue living as prisoners. We had to show that we were still soldiers." Private Yamamoto Kenji, who had refused to participate and been beaten by other prisoners, stated, "Some men said it was better to die fighting than to live like dogs. They said the Australians' kindness was an insult, that we were being kept alive to shame us. The cultural chasm was complete. The Australians had provided food, shelter, medical care, and dignity. Everything the Geneva Convention required, everything civilized nations were supposed to do. The Japanese prisoners had interpreted that very mercy as mockery, as proof that their captors didn't respect them as warriors. The Australians had built safe barracks and provided adequate rations. The prisoners saw a comfortable prison that made it impossible to regain honor through death. The Australians had followed international law. The prisoners saw weakness that demanded exploitation. Even after the breakout, the cultural misunderstanding continued. The Australian authorities buried the Japanese dead with military honours in a designated cemetery, marking each grave, maintaining records. To the Australians, this was basic decency. To many surviving Japanese prisoners, it was further proof that the Australians didn't understand these men should have been cremated according to Buddhist or Shinto rites. Their ashes sent home to their families, not buried in Australian soil like they were Australian soldiers. The psychological aftermath rippled through both groups. The surviving Japanese prisoners fell into two camps. Some became even more withdrawn and hostile, viewing survival as an additional layer of shame. They'd failed even in their attempt to die honorably. Others, having survived the breakout and realized that death hadn't solved anything, began to cooperate more with camp authorities, reasoning that if they couldn't reclaim honor through death, perhaps they could at least exist until the war ended. The Australian guards were traumatized in different ways. They'd followed orders, defended themselves, done everything right according to their training and the law. Yet they'd killed over 30 men who were essentially committing suicide by soldier. Private Jones, the tower guard, later wrote in his diary, "They wanted us to kill them. Some of them ran at the guns with their arms spread wide, like they were welcoming the bullets. What are you supposed to do with that? How do you defend against someone who wants to die?" The broader Allied command struggled to understand the implications. If Japanese soldiers would rather die than accept humane treatment as prisoners, what did that mean for the war? Intelligence reports from Cowra circulated through Allied headquarters. The consensus was troubling. Japanese forces couldn't be expected to surrender even when facing hopeless situations. Every island, every position, every strong point would have to be taken by force. The breakout at Cowra suggested that the Pacific War would continue to be extraordinarily bloody all the way to the end, because the enemy's psychology made surrender effectively impossible. The war, of course, did eventually end. On August 15, 1945, exactly 1 year and 10 days after the Cowra breakout, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. Millions of Japanese soldiers laid down their arms. The surviving prisoners at Cowra and other Allied camps suddenly faced a new reality. They would have to return to Japan as POWs after all. The repatriation process was complex and painful. Many prisoners initially requested to remain in Australia or be sent to a Pacific island anywhere but Japan. They feared execution or at minimum complete social ostracism. In September 1944, neutral inspectors visiting the camps recorded prisoners saying that if they couldn't be given asylum outside Japan, mass suicide might result. The psychological damage ran deep. The survivors were eventually repatriated between December 1945 and late 1947. Australian authorities, worried about potential violence given the revelations of Japanese treatment of Allied POWs, transported the prisoners under heavy guard. The ships carrying them back to Japan encountered severe storms during the journey. Another irony, given how many had died seeking the storm of battle. LST-273 had engine trouble. The Japanese prisoners on board, facing genuine danger from weather, worked alongside American sailors to keep the ship afloat. They survived the storm. They hadn't survived their shame. What happened to the returnees in Japan varied. Some families did reject them. Others quietly accepted them back, never speaking of their captivity. Many discovered that Japan's total defeat had scrambled all the previous certainties. If the entire nation had surrendered, how could individual soldiers be shamed for the same act? But the psychological scars remained. Many Cowra survivors never spoke about their experiences, not even to their families. The shame was too deep, too complex, too bound up with questions about whether they should have died on that August night in 1944. The Australian town of Cowra, meanwhile, began a long process of reconciliation. In 1963, the Australian government ceded land near the former camp to Japan for a war cemetery. The bodies of the 231 prisoners who died in the breakout were interred there, along with Japanese war dead from elsewhere in Australia. It remains the only Japanese war cemetery on Australian soil. The cemetery is meticulously maintained, with each grave marked and honoured. In 1979, something remarkable happened. The Cowra Japanese Garden and Cultural Centre opened on a hill overlooking the former campsite. Designed by landscape architect Ken Nakajima in the style of the Edo period, it covers 12 acres and is the largest Japanese garden in the Southern Hemisphere. The garden was built with funding from both Australia and Japan, a symbol of the friendship that eventually grew from the tragedy. Former prisoners and former guards attended the opening ceremony together, old men now, trying to make peace with what had happened decades earlier. The last survivor of the Cowra breakout, Teruo Murakami, died in Japan on September 14, 2023, at the age of 99. In interviews late in his life, he struggled to explain what had happened that night. "We were young," he said. "We believed what we were taught. We couldn't imagine living with shame. Now I think maybe we were wrong. But at the time, it felt like the only choice." The Cowra breakout stands as one of World War II's most psychologically revealing incidents. It demonstrated the collision between Western military culture, which viewed surrender as a tactical option and prisoner treatment as a legal obligation, and Japanese military culture, which viewed surrender as spiritual death and mercy as an insult. Neither side was wrong by their own cultural logic. The Australians followed international law and provided humane treatment. The Japanese prisoners followed their military code and sought death over dishonour. The result was tragedy. The deeper irony is this: the shelter, the Australians, offered safety, food, medical care. The chance to survive the war was precisely what made life unbearable for many prisoners. They didn't need better conditions. They needed worse ones, needed suffering and abuse that would justify their surrender, needed cruelty that would transform them from failures into victims. By treating them well, the Australians inadvertently made their psychological torment worse. The prisoners weren't rejecting shelter from a storm, they were rejecting shelter from their own judgment of themselves. In the end, 231 men died not because conditions were harsh, but because they were humane. They died not to escape captivity, but to escape mercy. They died because the shelter offered to them a clean bed, adequate food. Safety behind wire was a shelter they'd been taught to despise more than death itself. The storm they needed to survive wasn't made of wind and rain, it was made of shame. And the only shelter they could accept was the shelter of oblivion. The morning of August 6, 1944, dawned clear over Cowra. The sun rose on a compound littered with bodies, on barracks still smouldering, on blood-soaked ground and shattered wire. Australian soldiers walked among the dead, trying to understand what they'd witnessed. They'd been trained to guard prisoners, to prevent escape, to maintain security. They'd done all of that. But they hadn't been trained for prisoners who would rather die than be guarded, who viewed escape as a path to death rather than freedom, who considered the guards' mercy to be the greatest cruelty of all. Private Jones stood in the parade ground as the sun climbed higher, looking at the bodies awaiting identification and burial. "We tried to keep them safe," he later wrote. "We gave them everything we were supposed to give prisoners, and they hated us for it. I don't think I'll ever understand." He was right. He never did. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical 5 breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.